Here's something that will stop you in your tracks. The most dangerous voice in your entire life isn't the critic shouting at you from across the room. It isn't the person judging you or the world holding you back. It's the voice that sounds exactly like you. The one that speaks softly, reasonably, almost protectively. The one that whispers, just wait a little longer, or think about it more carefully, or maybe you're not quite ready yet. That voice doesn't scream or attack. It murmurs. It suggests. It sounds so much like wisdom that you trust it without question. And that's precisely how it destroys you. You didn't wake up one morning suddenly terrified of your own potential. Nobody does. It happened gradually, almost invisibly, like water wearing down stone. A thought you dismissed, a chance you delayed, an instinct you talked yourself out of. Over weeks and months and years, hesitation stopped being a response and became your default operating system. You started rehearsing life instead of living it, imagining conversations instead of having them, planning futures you never actually stepped into. And somewhere in that slow transformation, you made a catastrophic mistake. You confused caution with intelligence. You mistook fear for wisdom. Self-doubt doesn't arrive wearing a monster's face. It arrives dressed as protection, as a concerned friend saying, "Not yet. You're not ready. Wait until you're better prepared." But here's what that voice never tells you. Better never arrives. There's no magical moment when doubt suddenly approves of your readiness. It only knows one skill, and that skill is postponement. Like a parasite living inside your nervous system, self-doubt feeds on uncertainty, growing stronger every single time you listen to it. It learns your psychological weak points, memorizes your past mistakes, catalogs your failures, and weaponizes them as evidence against your future. Not to destroy you outright, but to keep you small, manageable, contained within a shrinking comfort zone. Think about a child standing at the edge of a swimming pool for the first time. Toes curled over the edge, heart pounding. They want to jump, their body wants to move, but their mind floods with catastrophic predictions. The water looks freezing. The fall looks terrifying. The landing looks dangerous. So they step back, choosing safety over experience. 20 years later, that same child stands before different pools, different opportunities, different moments demanding courage, but the feeling is identical. They hesitate before speaking their truth, before making the leap, before starting what matters, not because they lack ability, but because something deep inside insists they shouldn't. Neuroscience reveals something unsettling here. The human brain is evolutionarily wired to prioritize avoiding pain over pursuing reward. Dr. Joseph Ledoux, a neuroscientist at NYU, has spent decades studying the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system. His research shows that this almond-shaped structure scans for danger constantly, even when no actual threat exists. Over time, through conditioning and repetition, your survival instinct transforms into a psychological prison guard. It convinces you that comfort equals safety, and safety equals survival. But here's what it deliberately conceals. Comfort, when chosen repeatedly and obsessively, slowly suffocates growth. Avoidance practiced long enough and consistently enough stops being a strategy and becomes your identity. You watch other people move forward and wonder what mysterious quality they possess that you lack. Confidence, talent, luck, some genetic advantage you weren't born with. But the truth is darker and simpler than you imagine. They're not inherently braver than you. They're not fundamentally different. They've simply stopped negotiating with fear every single time they need to take a step forward. And that raises the question that changes everything. If self-doubt is the quiet, invisible force systematically shaping your choices, shrinking your possibilities, and rewriting your future without your conscious permission, why does it control so many intelligent, capable people? And more importantly, how do some rare individuals manage to eliminate it completely? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand your own mind. Where self-doubt is actually born, have you ever wondered why self-doubt feels ancient? why it appears before you've even made a mistake, as if it's been patiently waiting for you since before you can remember. That's because, in the most literal sense, it has been. Self-doubt doesn't begin the day you experience failure or rejection. It begins much earlier, the day you unconsciously learn that being fully yourself isn't always safe. Picture a young child standing in a room where love feels subtly conditional, not absent, not cruel, just selective. Affection flows when they behave in approved ways, when they stay quiet at the right moments, when they don't ask too many challenging questions or express too much inconvenient emotion. Curiosity sometimes earns a dismissive look. Emotional expression creates visible discomfort in the adults. Natural confidence gets corrected or redirected. Slowly, through thousands of micro-interactions, a message embeds itself deep in the child's developing nervous system. You are accepted when you are easy to manage. And so the child adapts, not consciously or deliberately, instinctively, like water conforming to the shape of whatever container it's poured into. At first, the adaptation looks completely harmless. The child simply learns to pause before speaking, to read the emotional temperature of the room, to sense tension in adults and adjust their behavior accordingly. But beneath these surface behaviors, something more profound is happening in their developing brain. The nervous system begins creating a powerful association. Authentic self-expression equals psychological risk. Attachment theory, pioneered by psychiatrist John Bowlby and psychologist Mary Ainsworth, provides crucial insight here. Their decades of research demonstrated that when emotional safety feels uncertain or inconsistent, a child learns to constantly monitor themselves rather than freely exploring the world. They become hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant. They trade spontaneity for survival. This is how self-doubt is born, not as a character flaw or weakness, but as an adaptive survival strategy. Over time, through repetition and reinforcement, the pattern deepens and solidifies. A teacher corrects too sharply in front of the class. A parent compares them unfavorably to siblings or peers. A moment of genuine excitement or vulnerability is met with awkward silence or subtle rejection. Each small moment, seemingly insignificant in isolation, teaches the same fundamental lesson. Your instincts cannot be trusted. Your natural responses are somehow wrong. And so the developing child starts outsourcing their sense of internal truth. They look constantly outward for permission and validation. They hesitate before acting. They make themselves smaller, quieter, less visible. Dr. Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, explains how the nervous system learns that stillness equals safety, that invisibility equals a form of control over an unpredictable environment. His research shows that repeated emotional invalidation literally rewires the developing brain toward constant threat anticipation. The amygdala, that primitive alarm system, becomes increasingly reactive and sensitive. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for confidence, decision-making, and self-directed action, learns a completely different lesson. Hesitation is wisdom. What begins as necessary childhood adaptation quietly hardens into rigid adult identity. By the time that child becomes a teenager, then an adult, self-doubt no longer feels foreign or imposed. It feels completely familiar. It feels like home. It feels like just who they are. And here's the cruel psychological twist that most people never recognize. The exact same protective mechanism that once kept you emotionally safe as a vulnerable child becomes the primary force keeping you psychologically small as a capable adult. The mask that helped you belong and survive now slowly suffocates your authentic self. The shadow that once protected you from rejection now whispers constant warnings at every opportunity for growth or expression. You grow up genuinely believing you're simply being cautious, humble, realistic. You never realize you're actually just afraid, deeply afraid to trust your own perceptions, judgments, and instincts. That's the hidden tragedy embedded in self-doubt. It's not a flaw in your character or a sign of fundamental weakness. It's a survival skill, once essential and adaptive, that has dramatically outlived its original protective purpose. But what once shielded you as a powerless child becomes something far more dangerous and limiting as an autonomous adult. Because the world no longer punishes you for speaking your truth or taking up space. It simply waits, patiently and silently, to see if you ever will. The adult mask. When self-doubt disguises itself as wisdom, have you noticed how self-doubt rarely announces itself directly anymore? It doesn't say you're afraid or you're being a coward. It says you're being realistic. It doesn't accuse you of shrinking from life. It congratulates you for being appropriately humble. By the time you reach full adulthood, doubt has learned to dress professionally. It knows how to speak calmly and rationally. It knows exactly how to sound intelligent, measured, and wise. It no longer feels like paralyzing fear. It feels like sophisticated wisdom. You start recognizing its subtle presence in the smallest daily moments. The text message you rewrite 5, 6, 7 times before sending, terrified of sounding wrong or being misunderstood. The valuable idea you never share in meetings because someone else might articulate it better. The clear opportunity you quietly decline because you're not quite ready yet, even though you've been preparing for years. On the surface, these behaviors look like patience, maturity, thoughtfulness. But underneath the respectable facade, something else entirely is happening. You're negotiating with an invisible psychological force that constantly demands more preparation time and never, ever grants final permission. Self-doubt becomes a mask you wear for so long that you completely forget it's there. A safety harness you never unclip even when you're standing on completely solid ground. Even when the danger has long passed, you tell yourself you're just being appropriately careful, that you're not like those reckless people who leap without thinking. But what you don't notice, what you can't see from inside the cage, is how the walls are slowly moving inward. How your acceptable range of action shrinks so gradually that you mistake progressive confinement for mature comfort. There's a particular moment that almost everyone can recognize from their own experience. You're in a room, a meeting, a conversation, and you have something genuinely valuable to contribute. You feel it rise clearly in your chest, certain and true. And then just before the words can leave your mouth, something physically tightens in your throat. An internal voice asks quickly, but what if you're wrong? What if it sounds stupid? And in that brief pause, that moment of internal negotiation, someone else speaks. The moment passes. The contribution goes unmade. And you tell yourself it wasn't that important anyway. That's the mask performing its invisible work, keeping you safe and small. Psychology offers insight into why this happens so automatically. The human mind, as demonstrated by countless studies in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology, actively prefers the familiar even when the familiar is painful or limiting. Neuroscience reveals that uncertainty activates the same threat detection circuits in the brain as genuine physical danger. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, explains how the nervous system learns to equate silence with safety and hesitation with intelligent caution. Over years and decades, you begin to genuinely believe that constant restraint demonstrates depth, and that boldness signals foolishness. But here's the profound irony that nobody warns you about. What feels like admirable self-control is very often just systematic self-erasure. What feels like mature wisdom is frequently just fear that has learned to speak in logical-sounding sentences. You call it humility, but it's really the gradual disappearance of your authentic voice. You call it patience, but it's actually avoidance learning how to sound noble and virtuous. And the most haunting part of this entire dynamic, the world rarely pushes back against it. Society actively rewards you for being endlessly agreeable. It praises you for not taking up too much space, for not making others uncomfortable with your intensity or ambition. So the mask stays firmly in place. The shadow grows longer and more solid, and the version of you that once reached for things without overthinking, that once expressed ideas without endless self-censorship, becomes progressively quieter, smaller, easier to overlook and forget. Yet beneath all of this careful construction, something restless persists, a pressure you can't quite name. A sense that you're living slightly but persistently off-center from yourself, from who you actually are beneath the performance. And that chronic unease, that nameless tension you can't quite resolve, is actually the first crucial clue that this isn't just habit anymore. It's not just learned behavior. It's wiring, deep neurological wiring. And once you begin to understand how that wiring originally formed and how it continues to maintain itself, you start to see why breaking free can feel almost impossible, until you finally understand what's really happening inside your brain. The neuroscience of self-sabotage. Have you ever wondered why your own mind seems to actively sabotage you, even when nothing external is actually wrong? Why in moments of genuine opportunity, your body physically tightens as if real danger were standing directly in front of you? The unsettling truth is this: your brain doesn't fundamentally care about your happiness, your fulfillment, or your potential. It cares about one thing above all else: your survival. And in its ancient, primitive logic, doubt very often feels safer than courage. Inside your mind operates a voice that sounds perfectly reasonable but behaves like a psychological tyrant. Psychologists have labeled it the inner critic, but that name feels almost too gentle for what it actually does, for the systematic damage it inflicts. This voice isn't born from logic or accurate assessment. It's constructed and reinforced through repetition and conditioning. Every single time you hesitate, every time you retreat from challenge, every time you choose comfortable safety over authentic expression, your brain learns and records a lesson. It learns that silence equals safety. That restraint equals survival. That staying small prevents pain. And over time, through thousands of repetitions, that lesson hardens from preference into automatic instinct. Dr. Joseph Ledue's extensive neuroscience research at NYU reveals that the amygdala, the brain's primitive fear center, reacts significantly faster than conscious logical thought ever can. It scans constantly for potential threats before you're even consciously aware that scanning is happening. And here's the cruel neurological trick: the amygdala doesn't distinguish between a genuinely life-threatening predator and a psychologically challenging possibility. A risky career decision, a vulnerable emotional conversation, a moment of visible ambition, all register neurologically as danger. The brain immediately releases stress hormones. Cortisol floods your system. Your muscles tighten. Your thoughts narrow. Your breathing becomes shallow. And suddenly, without any conscious decision, doubt feels like reliable intuition. Fear feels like wisdom trying to protect you. This is how what neuroscientists call the dopamine gap forms and deepens. Your brain craves comfort, predictability, and familiarity because these states require minimal energy and feel neurologically safe. Growth and change, on the other hand, offer uncertainty, unpredictability, and the requirement of sustained effort. So the mind, operating on ancient survival programming, quietly rewires itself to favor what's already known, even when what's known is miserable, limiting, or soul-crushing. You begin unconsciously choosing familiar pain over unfamiliar freedom, not because you consciously want to suffer, but because your nervous system has been conditioned to believe that suffering in known forms is safer than change. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness demonstrates this pattern clearly. After enough experiences where effort feels unrewarded or where risk leads to pain, the brain systematically stops trying. You don't even notice the exact moment when it happens. You just gradually feel more tired, more indecisive, heavier, like something vital inside you has gone permanently quiet. And the most dangerous aspect of this entire process is that it feels completely logical, rational, and responsible. Your self-protective hesitation doesn't feel like dysfunction. It feels like maturity. But this is where the deepest illusion takes hold. What you experience as trustworthy intuition is very often just old memory wearing a convincing mask. It's your unprocessed past speaking directly through your present experience. It's the shadow of ancient fear pretending to be contemporary wisdom. The brain, as neuroscience consistently demonstrates, repeats what it knows through established neural pathways, not what is objectively true or currently relevant. Those pathways strengthen through repetition, not through accuracy or usefulness. So doubt, once practiced consistently and long enough, begins to feel less like a temporary state and more like your permanent personality. It stops being something you occasionally feel and becomes something you fundamentally are. You stop saying, "I'm feeling afraid right now," and start saying with complete conviction, "That's just who I am. I'm not the kind of person who does that." The cage locks from the inside. And the monster that once growled and announced its presence no longer needs to. It simply whispers, comfortably and convincingly, in a voice that sounds exactly like your own most reasonable thoughts. Yet beneath this conditioned wiring, beneath these automatic fear responses and limiting neural patterns, something else still exists. A quieter signal. A deeper awareness that knows, somehow, that this isn't the complete story. That what feels like unchangeable instinct might actually be inherited programming. And once you begin to clearly see that crucial distinction, you find yourself standing at the edge of something genuinely unsettling. The realization that self-doubt isn't just psychological preference or personality trait. It's identity deep. It's woven into how you fundamentally see yourself. And undoing it, truly eliminating it, will require finally facing the part of yourself you've been carefully avoiding all along. When self-doubt turns destructive, have you ever felt the quiet horror of knowing you could be significantly more than you are, and yet doing absolutely nothing about it? Not because you lack ability or resources, but because something inside you keeps gently pulling the brakes, softly but persistently, until effort itself begins to feel pointless. This is where self-doubt stops pretending to be protective and reveals its truly destructive face. This is where it stops whispering helpful caution and starts systematically dismantling your life from the inside. At first, the destruction looks completely harmless, even reasonable. You postpone a meaningful dream because the timing doesn't feel quite right. You delay an important decision because you want to feel absolutely certain first. You tell yourself you'll start tomorrow, next week, next year, when you're more prepared, more confident, more ready. But tomorrow never actually comes. It can't, because readiness is the carrot your doubt dangles eternally just out of reach. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, what began as appropriate patience transforms into complete paralysis. Days accumulate into months, months into years. Your dreams remain sealed like letters never opened, gathering dust, while life continues relentlessly without your participation. There's a particular kind of pain that emerges from watching others move forward while you remain frozen in place. Not simple jealousy exactly, but something heavier and more corrosive. A quiet resentment that grows in your chest, mixed with shame for feeling it at all. You start compulsively comparing your behind-the-scenes reality with everyone else's carefully curated highlights. You scroll endlessly, observe constantly, analyze obsessively, and every comparison feels like a verdict, a judgment on your worth. They're living fully. You're waiting indefinitely, and the waiting becomes such an ingrained habit that you forget you're doing it. Psychologically, this is the precise point where self-doubt mutates into active self-sabotage. The brain, conditioned over years to associate risk with danger, begins to treat effort itself as a threat. The amygdala fires warning signals at the mere idea of visibility or exposure. Meanwhile, dopamine, the crucial neurotransmitter of motivation and reward, grows progressively weaker with every delayed action, every abandoned start. Over time, you don't just fear failure anymore. You begin to fear movement itself, any movement at all. So you procrastinate with increasing sophistication. You numb yourself through endless distractions. You stay busy with activities that feel productive but fundamentally change nothing about your situation. Emotionally, the cumulative cost is absolutely devastating. The longer you systematically suppress your instincts and authentic impulses, the quieter they become. Passion fades like a dying ember. Curiosity dulls to almost nothing. You begin to feel like a passive spectator in your own life, watching from behind thick glass as opportunities and possibilities pass by untouched. The garden inside you, once full of potential, goes completely untended. Not because you lack seeds or fertile soil, but because you've convinced yourself, through years of conditioning, that nothing will grow anyway. And so the soil hardens. The ground becomes inhospitable. And perhaps the most painful part of this entire process is that self-doubt rarely explodes in obvious crises. It doesn't create dramatic breaking points that force change. It erodes, slowly, silently, steadily. It doesn't scream, it sighs. It drains color from ambition like water leaching pigment from fabric. It replaces desire with numbness, passion with resignation. And because the erosion happens so gradually, you adjust to it. You normalize the growing heaviness. You tell yourself, this is just adulthood. This is reality. This is simply how life feels for everyone. But beneath that weary resignation lies something more unsettling and more painful. A quiet, persistent grief for the person you might have become. A resentment toward those who dare to act while you watch. A profound loneliness that comes not from being physically alone, but from being psychologically absent from your own life. Dr. Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion reveals how this internal abandonment creates what she calls isolation in plain sight. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone because the most important relationship, the one with yourself, has been severed. And here's the twist that nobody warns you about, the hidden mechanism that makes this so difficult to escape. The world very often rewards this kind of quiet self-erasure. It praises excessive humility. It applauds extreme restraint. It calls your silence maturity and your self-abandonment wisdom, which is precisely why the most dangerous aspect of self-doubt isn't the pain it causes you personally. It's how easily it hides behind social approval, how it disguises itself as virtue. And once you finally see that clearly, you begin to realize that the problem isn't just personal or individual. It's cultural and systemic. And that realization changes absolutely everything. How society maintains your self-doubt. Have you ever wondered why? No matter how much you grow or develop, there's always a quiet pressure telling you to stay smaller. Why genuine confidence feels vaguely risky or inappropriate, but self-doubt feels strangely acceptable and even admirable. That's because self-doubt isn't just something you learn during childhood in your specific family. It's something modern society carefully cultivates and maintains. From the moment you're old enough to observe and absorb the world around you, you're systematically taught to compare yourself. Your grades against classmates, your appearance against media images, your follower count against peers, your salary against arbitrary standards, your life timeline against cultural expectations. You're shown endless highlight reels and told these represent normal standards. You're praised for productivity, but only when it fits within invisible, unspoken rules. You're encouraged to dream, but only dreams that don't meaningfully disrupt the established order of things. Somewhere along the way, through thousands of subtle messages, you learn that standing out invites uncomfortable scrutiny, and staying quiet earns widespread approval. Social media has perfected this conditioning mechanism with terrifying efficiency. These platforms feed your brain small, calculated hits of dopamine while simultaneously sharpening underlying insecurity. You scroll through carefully curated lives, professionally edited images, impossible success stories presented as ordinary reality. And your nervous system, which didn't evolve to distinguish between lived experience and repeated digital exposure, interprets all of it as real. Neuroscience research by Dr. Larry Rosen and others demonstrates that the brain doesn't effectively distinguish between directly experienced events and information encountered through repeated exposure. So every filtered image becomes an impossible mirror. Every success story you witness becomes a silent accusation. And the more you compare, the more your own unedited life begins to feel fundamentally insufficient. There's a cruel contradiction embedded at the heart of modern culture. You're told constantly to be confident, but not too confident. Bold, but not disruptive. Authentic, but only if your authenticity remains palatable and comfortable for others. The moment you step outside these invisible boundaries, the moment you speak too loudly, dream too freely, or refuse to conform to expectations, the same system that once applauded your potential begins to recoil. Suddenly you're too much, too intense, too ambitious, too different. This is how society trains obedience without requiring obvious force. It doesn't need to punish you directly through violence or explicit control. It simply withholds approval, recognition, and belonging. And because humans are fundamentally wired for social connection, that absence hurts more than active rejection. Attachment research demonstrates that social exclusion activates the exact same neural pathways as physical pain. The brain literally experiences rejection as injury, so you adapt to avoid that pain. You soften your rough edges. You edit your authentic voice. You wear whatever mask gets you accepted, even when it costs you your truth, your passion, your actual self. Over time, this creates a profound internal conflict. One part of you desperately wants expansion, full expression, meaningful risk. Another part wants safety, approval, and guaranteed belonging. The second voice usually wins the internal argument, not because it's stronger or wiser, but because it's been reinforced and rewarded thousands upon thousands of times. You learn to doubt yourself before others even have the chance to do it for you. You learn to shrink preemptively, protectively. And that preemptive shrinking begins to feel like maturity, wisdom, appropriate social functioning. But here's the uncomfortable realization most people never quite reach. A society built fundamentally on comparison and control actually depends on your self-doubt. It runs on it like fuel. A person who fully trusts themselves, who acts from internal conviction rather than external approval, is remarkably hard to manipulate, hard to sell to, hard to control, hard to keep compliant. So the culture subtly but persistently teaches you to question your instincts, to second-guess your perceptions, to doubt your worthiness, all while calling it humility, realism, or appropriate caution. And once you clearly see that mechanism, something fundamental shifts in your awareness. You begin to realize your self-doubt isn't just personal weakness or individual failure. It's a learned response to an environment that directly benefits from your hesitation and uncertainty, which raises a genuinely dangerous question, dangerous to the status quo. If this doubt was systematically taught to you, conditioned into you, what happens when you consciously start unlearning it? The emotional cost of self-abandonment. Have you ever noticed how exhaustion can exist even when you haven't physically moved? How you can feel profoundly tired not from doing too much, but from holding yourself back for too long. That's the quiet, accumulating cost of never trusting yourself. It doesn't arrive with dramatic chaos or obvious collapse. It settles in slowly, like dust on furniture you no longer use, until one day you realize your entire inner world feels heavy, stale, untouched. There's a particular kind of loneliness that emerges from constant self-questioning. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the far more painful loneliness of being completely disconnected from your own voice, your own knowing. You replay conversations in your head long after they end, obsessively wondering if you said too much or not enough, if you sounded stupid or made sense. You imagine alternate versions of yourself, braver, sharper, more fully alive, existing somewhere just out of reach, in a parallel life you can almost touch but never quite inhabit. At night, when everything finally goes quiet, those alternate versions feel closer. They haunt you, not as hope or inspiration, but as painful reminders of what you didn't become, of who you could have been if only you trusted yourself. Psychologically, this kind of chronic doubt creates what researchers call decision fatigue and rumination exhaustion. Dr. Roy Baumeister's research on ego depletion demonstrates that the mind, when trapped in perpetual evaluation mode, burns enormous amounts of mental energy without ever reaching resolution. Studies on chronic rumination show that the brain, forced to constantly second-guess itself, eventually begins to shut down emotionally. You feel less intensely. You want less desperately, not because you've healed or found peace, but because you're simply too exhausted to keep hoping. It's a form of emotional starvation, like a garden that once bloomed vibrantly but no longer receives water, sunlight, or care. You might notice this erosion in your relationships first. You hesitate to speak honestly about what you feel or need. You swallow discomfort repeatedly to keep the peace and avoid conflict. Over time, resentment quietly replaces genuine connection. You feel fundamentally unseen, yet you're the one actively hiding. You create your own invisibility. And the cruel paradox embedded in this dynamic is that the more you silence yourself to avoid potential conflict or rejection, the more isolated and alone you feel inside your relationships. Attachment theory, particularly the work of Dr. Sue Johnson, explains this pattern clearly. When self-trust erodes completely, people respond in one of two dysfunctional ways. They either cling desperately, seeking constant external validation, or they withdraw completely, protecting themselves through isolation. Both strategies ultimately lead to the same destination: profound loneliness. There's often a moment, usually late at night, when all the noise and distraction finally fades, when the truth slips through your defenses. You lie awake staring at the ceiling, involuntarily replaying choices you didn't make, paths you didn't take. You wonder with genuine grief how your life might feel different if you had just trusted yourself one more time, taken one more risk. The sadness isn't dramatic or theatrical. It's dull, heavy, persistent, like carrying a weight you've forgotten how to put down. This is the real emotional tax of chronic doubt. Not spectacular failure, but the slow, quiet grief of unrealized potential, the mourning of a life half-lived. And perhaps the most painful part of this entire experience is this: you begin to lose touch with who you actually are beneath all the doubt and fear. Your intuition, once clear, grows so quiet you can barely hear it anymore. Your authentic desires blur into vague, undefined feelings. You stop asking yourself, what do I actually want? And start asking only what's acceptable, what's safe. The mask becomes your face. The hesitation becomes your identity. You aren't living anymore. You're managing yourself, controlling yourself, containing yourself. Yet buried beneath all that exhaustion and resignation is something fragile but genuinely powerful. A faint awareness that this isn't how life is meant to feel. A sense that the numbness isn't your true nature but a protective response to years of self-abandonment. And that realization, uncomfortable as it is, becomes the first small crack in the wall you've built around yourself. Because once you fully feel the cost of self-doubt, once you allow yourself to honestly grieve what it has taken from you, you also begin to sense something else rising beneath the grief. Not confidence yet, not sudden courage, but the quiet, dangerous idea that maybe, just maybe, the voice you've been ignoring and suppressing all these years was never wrong at all. How certain minds kill self-doubt completely. Have you ever noticed how the people who seem genuinely confident rarely look certain? They hesitate. They stumble. They get things wrong. They doubt specific decisions, but they move anyway, consistently and persistently. That's the secret most people never realize, the thing that changes everything once you understand it. Confidence is not the absence of fear or doubt. It's the absence of self-betrayal. The moment you stop habitually abandoning yourself, something fundamental begins to shift and change. For most of your life, you were taught to wait until you felt completely ready, to wait until the fear disappeared entirely, to wait until you were absolutely sure. But that moment of perfect readiness never comes. It can't come because it doesn't exist. Neuroscience research, particularly the work of Dr. Stephen Porges on polyvagal theory, shows that certainty is not a prerequisite for effective action. It's actually a byproduct of action. The brain learns safety through direct experience, not through contemplation or mental preparation. Your nervous system doesn't become confident by thinking about confidence. It becomes confident by surviving experiences that once seemed dangerous. Yet self-doubt cleverly convinces you to reverse this natural order. It demands clarity before movement, even though clarity only arrives after you've already stepped forward into uncertainty. The shift begins quietly, almost invisibly. It doesn't look heroic or dramatic. It looks like sending the message even though your hands are physically shaking, speaking up while your voice trembles, choosing a direction without knowing the ending, making a decision before you feel ready. These moments feel small, almost insignificant when they happen, but they rewire something deep inside your nervous system. Each time you act despite fear, each time you move forward without permission, your brain updates its fundamental story about reality. The amygdala gradually loosens its panicked grip. The body slowly learns through direct experience that uncertainty does not automatically equal danger. The nervous system recalibrates. People who successfully overcome crippling self-doubt don't wake up one morning suddenly feeling fearless. That's a myth. They simply stop waiting for permission, internal or external. They stop negotiating endlessly with the voice that demands perfection before allowing progress. They understand, often intuitively rather than intellectually, that fear is not a stop sign or a warning to turn back. It's a signal, an indicator that something meaningful is nearby, that growth is possible. And instead of automatically retreating when fear appears, they learn to lean into it, to move toward it. There's a moment that comes, usually after many small acts of courage have accumulated, when something shifts internally. You realize with quiet surprise that the voice that once completely controlled you has grown noticeably quieter, not because it disappeared or because you defeated it in some final battle, but because you stopped automatically obeying it. You stopped treating it as an authority. You no longer ask, "What if I fail?" as if that question should end the conversation. You start asking instead, "What happens if I don't try? What does it cost me to stay here?" And that question, asked honestly, carries genuine weight. It cuts through comfortable excuses. It exposes the real cost of staying still, of remaining safe. Psychologically, this is where authentic self-trust is actually built. Not through affirmations repeated in the mirror, not through positive thinking or manifestation, but through accumulated evidence, direct, personal evidence. Every single time you act despite fear and survive the experience, your brain updates its internal map of what's possible and what's safe. The old, limiting neural pathways begin to weaken. New pathways form and strengthen. Confidence stops being primarily a feeling you wait for and becomes instead a pattern you practice. You sharpen it through use, not through admiration. Like burning old, inaccurate maps and learning to navigate by developing instinct and direct experience. There's a strange, unexpected freedom in finally realizing you don't need to feel ready. You don't need permission. You just need to move, slowly if necessary. Imperfectly, certainly, but honestly, authentically. The mask loosens. The shadow gradually fades, and in its place something steadier emerges. Not bravado or false confidence. Not arrogant certainty, but a quiet alignment with yourself, a sense of being home in your own skin. And once that alignment genuinely begins, something profound happens. You stop asking how to eliminate doubt entirely, and you start asking a far more useful and dangerous question. What kind of life becomes possible when I stop letting doubt make my decisions for me? The final truth. Self-trust as liberation. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful changes in life rarely announce themselves with fanfare? They don't arrive with certainty or dramatic breakthroughs. They come quietly, almost invisibly, in moments when absolutely no one is watching, in the private space between hesitation and action, in the instant you choose not to betray yourself again. That's where self-trust is actually born. For most of your life, you were systematically taught to look outward for permission and validation, to wait for approval from authorities, to measure yourself against standards you never personally chose. Somewhere along that path, you began to believe that confidence was something granted by others, not claimed by yourself. That certainty was a prerequisite for movement rather than its natural result. And so you learned, through thousands of reinforcements, to pause, to question, to shrink. Not because you were fundamentally weak, but because you were trying to survive in a world that rewarded obedience far more than it rewarded authenticity. But there comes a moment, quiet and almost unremarkable when it happens, when something shifts deep inside. It's not loud or obvious. There's no dramatic epiphany. It's just a realization settling slowly in your chest, taking root. You are exhausted from abandoning yourself, tired of silencing your instincts, tired of negotiating with fear as if it were a legitimate authority rather than an outdated protective mechanism. That exhaustion, strange as it sounds, becomes the beginning of your freedom. Philosophers throughout history have argued that the deepest form of freedom isn't control over external circumstances, but alignment with your authentic self. Neuroscience echoes this ancient wisdom in its own language. When you act in accordance with your genuine values, when your choices reflect who you actually are rather than what you fear, the brain demonstrably calms. The nervous system softens. The internal conflict quiets. You stop wasting enormous amounts of energy on resistance and internal warfare. You begin, finally, to move as an integrated whole rather than a collection of warring parts. Self-trust doesn't make you fearless. That's another myth. It makes you honest. Brutally, uncomfortably honest. Honest about what you genuinely want. Honest about what you actually feel. Honest about what you can no longer tolerate or accept. It's the difference between living behind a protective mask and stepping fully into your own shadow without flinching. Between protecting yourself from potential pain and choosing a life that feels real, even when reality includes discomfort. You can see the difference clearly in people who have crossed this threshold. They don't seek permission before acting. They don't over-explain their choices. They move with a certain stillness, a groundedness that doesn't need to be proven or validated. They've stopped asking the world who they're allowed to be. They've stopped outsourcing their worth to external judges. They've stopped waiting for someone else to grant them permission to exist fully. And here's the quiet truth most people never realize. Self-doubt is not actually your enemy. It's the final illusion, the last test before you step into your own authority. It exists to see whether you will keep asking for approval or finally choose yourself. Whether you'll keep abandoning yourself or finally come home. Because in the end, the people who transform their lives are not the bravest or the loudest or the most naturally confident. They are simply the ones who got tired of leaving themselves behind, who got exhausted from self-betrayal, who finally decided that living authentically, even with its risks and uncertainties, was better than slowly disappearing into safety. And when self-trust finally takes root in your nervous system, it doesn't announce itself dramatically. It doesn't shout or demand attention. It doesn't need validation from anyone. It simply stands there steady and unshaken, quiet and certain. And once it's there, nothing controls you anymore. Not fear, not doubt, not other people's opinions or expectations. You become, in the truest sense, free.